Counter-Narrative News, bringing you a week in review today on Sunday, the 12th of February 2023. Today we're going to focus on what is Brexit Britain? What did Brexit do to Britain, and what has been the ramifications of that, and what have we seen in terms of the concrete results as it pertains to community relations and relations between the poorer sections of the communities in Britain. On this day, that's the 12th of February, back in 1965, a very important global political figure based in the United States, Malcolm X, visited Smethwick in West Midlands. He visited a Marshall Road, if I'm not mistaken, and a Marshall Street, forgive me, and a few other residential roads around that area, in which he was standing in solidarity and support of African and Asian heritage working class residents who were receiving racist discrimination by landlords and by the political class in that region. Malcolm X was a really important figure, and we'll come to more to this, how he's relevant to this in terms of putting forward a framework of unity between working class people, particularly those people put outside the category of whiteness by the capitalist and colonial system. He advocated the quote-unquote Black Revolution in his message to the grassroots, basically uniting all of non-European people together in a framework of black resistance and liberation and revolution. And he's really interesting because he moved away from more relatively right-wing ideas and politics to much more of a socialist orientation and a left revolutionary orientation, hooking up with Abdurrahman Babu, the revolutionary from East Africa, from Zanzibar, who was very much part of the left radical socialist wing of the Pan-Africanist movement. Malcolm X was very much aligned to that as well in Accra with the Du Boises and with Kwame Nkrumah himself. And also he became a lot more sophisticated in his understandings in the importance of women's liberation, and he identified that the movements and countries moving in a socialist direction seemed to be providing the best solutions for oppressed black peoples across the world. Coming back to more contemporary times and focusing on some of the more recent results of what Brexit Britain has produced. In this last week, we've had an Irish traveller mob attack a black schoolgirl, and they've been arrested for racially aggravated assault by the authorities. Then what immediately followed that was basically a black chauvinist mobilization against one of the alleged residences of the Irish traveller mob attackers on the black schoolgirl, in which the racist slur pikey was used and threats of violence was evident at that mobilization. Now, the person who used pikey, that's Raspek Fire-Bingi, has subsequently apologized for that, but it's still a very messy situation in which two of the most oppressed communities, and the Irish traveller community being arguably one of the most oppressed and despised communities by racists and the racist state in this country. You have this awful situation of a growing confrontation and tensions between these two oppressed groups, which is, really, really sad. And then literally the next night following this, and one reflects that it isn't totally coincidental that what immediately followed on in another part of the country in the northwest, near Liverpool, in a town called Knowsley, in an area called Kirkby, that hundreds of local racists formed basically a violent racist lynch mob to attempt to attack asylum seekers being placed in a hotel. And this is in a community which is one of the most poorest communities in the world, and in which demographic relations between white community and others, black and brown communities, etc., has not improved in the last decade or two. So it was a really combustible situation. And then you've got the political atmosphere born out of the Brexit victory in June 2017, which really explicitly focuses people on scapegoating those communities that are quote unquote otherized, that they don't belong here naturally, that they are naturally somehow incompatible with a white European nation and a white Anglo-Saxon nation such as England and Britain. And this all follows incidents last year in the first majority non-white city in this country, that's Leicester in the East Midlands area of England, where you had two groups of Asian working class young men marching on each other. And the reason they did that was they were divided along religious lines organized by supremacists on both sides. And by supremacists, it's what one means by that is it's a mirror reflection of white supremacy to say that the constructed ethnic racialized group in which we are above and better and superior to all others, so we reign supreme, and therefore the other groups who are quote unquote lower than us or dehumanized do not deserve the same rights to be treated as human beings as we do, and we in the supremacist group have a right to oppress others in the quote unquote lower group. So you had this clashes between Muslim and Hindu South Asian young men in Leicester in 2022. Very, very sad state of affairs. So Brexit was designed to explicitly include this form of white supremacy and othering in the government itself. And it's not to say that this kind of politics and culture was not, and policies was not evident in the British state before. Of course it has been for centuries. It was back in the 11th century actually that the emerging colonial English state conducted its first racist colonial crusades into the into what's known as today's Palestine, and also that they formed formal policies against Jewish people at that same time as well, in and around the 12th century. So this has gone on for nearly millennia. But what Brexit did, it gathered all the most viciously racist forces within the establishment and the mainstream politics, but also on the periphery in terms of the far right. And all these far right ideas became official policy that defines what Britain is. It's the new identity of Britain, and it was very explicit in terms of the infamous long queue of migrants that Nigel Farage stood in front of that poster, the infamous bus saying, if we get rid of these again, othering the European Union. Of course, the European Union is a very elitist, neo-colonial, capitalist colonial institution itself, but still it was othered to then manufacture this kind of essentialized Brexit Britain supremacism. And so, so once the bus said, once we got rid of the EU, there'll be 350 million pounds a week or a month to invest in the NHS. And of course, as everyone is seeing, the NHS continues to be privatized and run down by the Tories because there's a lot of money for them and their friends to be made in that process. And this othering and dehumanization around the person and the community of migrant and migrants, of immigrants, of refugees, of asylum seekers is very much how Brexit was defined, in a violent, hostile posture against that. Now, that also overlaps into black and brown communities of Asian and African and Caribbean heritage as well, because this is an island nation. Everyone is a migrant to this country, so anyone who can be visually identified as not looking like quote-unquote white British can also be easily put into the category of the otherized migrant or immigrant or refugee. And we saw that in the attack on the African Caribbean community around the Windrush scandal and attack in not naturalizing and confirming the permanent status here of migrants of the Windrush generation. And then also, this is all in line very much with Hitlerite Nazism, because that was also defined by othering the Jew and the Jewish community as quote-unquote not belonging to the German state. And it was very clever in terms of globalizing that othering in the phrase that Hitler used and the Nazis used as not just the Jew, but the quote-unquote Jewish Bolshevik. So to say that there's a global conspiracy against the great white German Aryan nation, which has been conducted by the Jewish Bolshevik. You have the similar parallels here of these far-right conspiracy theories of the globalists and the European Union and the Jew in the form of George Soros, etc., somehow being the primary enemy of the people, which then fits into migrants and refugees, which the far-right claim are being instrumentalized by these nefarious, basically kind of slightly, quote-unquote Jewish and the Soros and all of this kind of thing. So it's all very, this is an old story of basically the logical conclusion of European capitalist nationalisms. And so Brexit explicitly unites the far-right and far-right concepts into the leading national project and identity, which is Brexit Britain. So all of this really does come, this big jump up of racism that we've seen in recent years is very much explicitly as a result of that, and the Tories have taken their advantage around that, as aforementioned with the Windrush scandal, but also in trying to convince people that asylum seekers arriving on small boats is somehow the biggest social crisis that people are facing, when obviously there's other greater crises that all working class people are facing, the cost of living crisis, etc. Then, so in counter response, what is the picture or the framework or the actual existence of a pushback, an antidote to this growing racism of Brexit Britain? What is the counter response? What is the resistance here? And that's where Malcolm X, again on this day, visiting Smethwick in 1965, is very interesting, because he had a framework which he applied, and he did not distinguish in terms of understanding quote-unquote black people between Asian and African heritage people, as evidenced by his visit to Smethwick and also visiting other grassroots activists and radicals of African and Asian heritage. He mixed with both, and he was very comfortable doing that. And he was comfortable doing that because he understood that people had been treated in very similar ways of being dehumanized by the colonial system, and that people have a immediate interest to unite with each other against a common framework of oppression, which is then manifested in physical forms of oppression by means of discrimination in housing, in employment, by means of war and conflict, etc., etc., etc. There's been a few examples, though, of unity that have mostly been spontaneous rather than organized. So there's an August 2011 uprising sparked by the racist killing of Mark Duggan in Tottenham in North London around the resistance community of Broadwater Farm Council Estate. So there was an uprising for 3 or 4 days. It was kind of black working class led, but it involved everyone, led the racist historian David Starkey to say, quote unquote, that the whites have turned black. There's an element of truth in that, in as much that, yes, white working class people understood that it was black radicalism in which they should attach themselves to resist according to their growing conditions of oppression and exploitation. And then Brexit Britain kind of reverses that. So instead of certain sections of the white community being in a positive relationship with resistant black people and culture, Brexit Britain reverses that and turns the quote, whites have turned black, into whites have turned on the black people, or on the blacks, which happened around the summer of 2020, when the kind of fight over colonial statues, etc. The far right decides to, including the leading far right figure of Tommy Robinson, Stephen Yaxley-Lennon, creates an anti-black posture in a violent attempt at quote unquote defending the Churchill statue in Parliament Square. Again, that's another example of a unity, of working class unity of resistance, when on June the 13th, 2020, black and brown and white working class youth, again black-led, fought back that racist provocation in Trafalgar Square and Waterloo and won that historic victory against organised racism. But there has been no other example, and intra-community tensions are growing, which are very purposefully promoted by the far right, but also the left internalizes this. And in the case when Jeremy Corbyn led the Labour Party, he had the Migrant Impact Fund, quote unquote, which is a racist policy, as part of his electioneering. He advocated for the more than 10,000 police, extra police to be on the streets. Police are, totally scandalous, growing scandals of violent rape and misogyny and violent racism all over the place. And also in terms of his ambiguous position on Brexit itself as well. There's other issues there, but you can see that these issues can be internalized by the left as well. So in conclusion, it's really important for people to return back to think about how they can confidently develop frameworks of unity. Now, the trade union strikes have been a baby step in the right direction, in as much as that people understand their commonality of their experience and their circumstances and conditions at work and in life in general, and understand who's responsible for that, i.e. the state and the capitalist employers. However, apart from the strike days themselves on picket lines and protests, nothing is coming out of that in terms of a movement, a political articulation in terms of an organized form of a project or initiative. It still yet remains to be seen if that's going to come out of these trade union strikes, but so far, and arguably the peak of the strikes has already occurred, and now there's a decline that's been occurring now for a couple of months already, that one wonders and worries whether anything really united is going to come out of that. So that's Counter-Narrative News, bringing you a week in review, reflecting upon Brexit Britain and what it's produced in terms of growing divisions at the point of the working class, and what people can reflect upon and look at to try and push back on that. Please continue to support us by encouraging others to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, @counter_CNN, and we wish you a fantastic evening.